This should be where I rant about the new Awilix skin. I won't rant, and that's because I think the end result as the skin as it is in the game now is actually okay. It's a nice skin, but at the same time it has issues that kind of reflect something regarding how HiRez treats community concepts in general and all these kind of contests, and that's what we'll talk about in this context. In order to see the full picture here, we're gonna look at some older skins first and then look at the Awilix skin. So, community skins are nothing new in SMITE. We've had various community commissions throughout the years, ever since Archon Thanatos. Archon Thanatos was probably the most successful one and is to this day one of the most requested, most highest demand skins out there, as it was just really good. This skin started off of a community concept. However, back then things worked a little differently. Instead of voting for a complete skin, multiple examples of skin themes were shown, and in this case we had two different examples which you can both see here. And those were a foundation for the final skin, whereas the final skin had a lot of artistic freedom. So it was clear from the start that the skin choice would just point out the general direction in which the skin would be going, whereas the artists at HiRez would give their own flavor, their own unique design style to match the game, etc. The next one was very different. Fallen Lord Kronos was the winner of another skin poll for a community skin, and the skin in-game actually looked very much like its original model. It lost a little bit in the shader department, so it wasn't quite as dark as the original, but overall it was very close to the original design. The problem was that people weren't actually too happy with it. First of all, a lot of people voted for other skins as well, so they didn't really want this kind of skin. And additionally, this skin just didn't translate all too well from being a really nice design into the game where it's just a graphic model that looks very different. Other designs would have probably worked better here, but they simply weren't voted for as much as the art wasn't that good, which in the end doesn't really matter because the skin in-game is the only thing you will see and not what the art beforehand looked like. The skin in fact got so much backlash that the original price was reduced from I think 600 to 400 in order to not upset people too much and kind of compensate for the fact that the skin is not what many people were hoping for. And again, this is despite the skin actually resembling its design relatively closely as far as it's possible, with limitations like for example the hair not being the same. And then we had the tier 5 mage skin Odyssey vote. Here, the examples of the skins we would see in-game were actually made by HiRez right away, so the concepts didn't really matter, as many of the concepts they came up with or they went with were not even based on actual art made by artists, but rather just descriptions of how the character could look like. Well, there were still a lot of submissions that actually included art beforehand as well. HiRez kind of dodged a bullet there by going with a design that they made themselves and that was just based off a description, instead of going for an artist design and butchering that in the process. Yet, at the same time, people were still not happy. And it wasn't so much about the skin itself, but rather the fact that there were a lot of great skin concepts that were voted for. There was actually a subreddit specifically to vote for skins, and that were way higher upvoted than any of these concepts, that didn't even get a chance, that didn't even get into further development because HiRez said they would be too complicated to implement, or they would not look different enough between the stages or something like that. For example, Wallwalker Janus was one of those where it was said that from the back he would just not change that much and not be as cool as people would think he is, when pretty much everyone voted for him in the forums. So you could say HiRez has a bit of a problematic history with community votes and dissatisfaction with that. Even if they don't do a community vote as they did for the Thor Ragnarok tier 5 skin, the community isn't all too happy because we like to have a say in things that we're gonna pay money for. And that brings us to Ailish. Ailish was the god that was voted for the next community skin, and the community was mostly happy with that because Ailish didn't have a new skin in a while, or at least not one that stood out in any way. HiRez pre-selected quite a few different skin concepts that we were able to choose from, and that's what we did. Now, an interesting thing to point out here is that out of the pre-selection from HiRez, quite a few were wearing skimpy clothes. Shouldn't be surprised, we talk about HiRez here. But those were not the ones that actually got the most votes. Despite HiRez trying to push things into that direction with their pre-selection, people didn't seem all too interested in skimpy cloth outfits, and they would rather see some cool styled skin with either badass armor or just a nice overall design. Or a nice ass, who knows. The winner was Midnight Dove by Awilix Sasquatch. A really cool skin that was somewhat between Night Elf, Fairy, Moonlight something, with a very unique Suku as well, which I think made a lot of people interested in that skin, which was a little bit skinnier, a little bit taller than you'd usually see him, not that much like a panther, but more like a cat, but also with unique features like front legs being claws instead of normal feet, and the back feet kind of looking like they have hooves, and a very fluffy, feathery design overall. Keep in mind that Suku is very often seen when playing Awilix, so he is definitely a decent reason of why a skin would be voted for aside of her model itself. Fast forward to when HiRez made their version of the winner model, how it should end up in game. Well, if you look at Suku here, he already looks quite different. We're back to the panther design, but he keeps his griffin front claws, at least. Everything else is kind of more like a recolored Suku with some added feathers and a, well, moon on top of his head, which kind of took away a fair bit of the uniqueness of the skin already, but was kind of to be expected because otherwise the skeleton of Suku would have been completely changed, which would have probably had some effect on the animation as well, also the 3, so there would have been a lot of changes that would have come with the skin, but at the same time it's kind of frustrating to see that such a big unique part of it gets taken away right there. And then fast forward again to the release of the skin, which we have now. One thing I gotta say, the card art is surprisingly accurately matching the skin. So I can actually go by the card art here instead of having to show you the in-game model, as it is pretty much the same. The only thing that you can't see are Suku's claws on his feet, which are still kinda griffin claws but also look kinda weird, so that's maybe why they hid that in the water in this particular card art. I would not be surprised if that was actually why. But that's not the main point. We know that Suku was changed decently, he also lost some more feathers once again, shouldn't be all too surprising here, but well, Suku is Suku and we knew kind of what he was gonna look like. I mean, in the end, if Ailish is supposed to look like a night elf, we might as well have her panther look like the default night elf mount from World of Warcraft, right? But what about Ailish herself? If we compare these two versions, there are quite some significant differences. And this is something that I, in this context, highly dislike for one particular reason. What has been changed about the skin completely takes away from the original artistic concept, the original direction the skin was going in. Basically, the whole character that was tied to this particular design is completely erased and only some features have been translated over. What do I mean? Look at this. The original design had pretty much spikes in any direction. The hair was spiky, pointing outwards, feathers everywhere on the back of her head, on her hips, on her arms, and on her shoes even, while she had these big wings going in both directions, making her look like a fairy. This is important. This is what really gave her this fairy vibe, these double wings in a way. And they all had this feathery look to them, so the whole skin looked really fluffy and also very in movement due to the fact that it basically had a cross in the middle of the body that was going away in every direction. It's in art style that would be a very energetic style. And now look at the Awilix version of the final skin. You'll see some feathers on her spear, you'll see a little bit of feathers on her hips, you'll see some feathers on her arm, but they are kind of not even going in wild direction anymore at all. They're just like almost like a shell or some scales or something. The feathers on her shoes are basically just spikes now, and that's pretty much about it. The wings almost look like plastic in this particular cutout. They look a little more animated in game though. Now I understand the limitations of design, as you have to animate all these feathers and it would be way too many movement aspects for a skeleton of a model to actually implement them as feathers. But if that's the case and that's known, then why let the skin go through? The skin lives from the idea of having these feathers everywhere. Okay, we have to restrict them. Then maybe we restrict them in a way where we have feathers in places that can't be as animated, just follow the motion of the legs or something. Or at least stick to the way of the spiky outward design where it's possible, like for example at the wings instead of rounding them off, or at the hair instead of rounding that off. All in all, this skin looks more like a cosplay version of the original design than the actual design. I once again think that it's a decent skin, it just doesn't match the original design at all. Furthermore, let's look at this. As I said, HiRez heavily tried to push one of the skimpier outfits as sex sells, and HiRez is very much aware of that and tries to, well, enforce that as much as possible. But in this skin, there wasn't so much sexualized stuff to start with. They had a little bit of cleavage up there and had a little bit of hip showing, but HiRez really went out of their way to show as much skin as possible while trying to somewhat stick to the design. If you see how much more chest area is visible, how much more cleavage there is, and also how there's a big area on both sides of the hips that just cut off just to show more skin. Well, I guess then at least the thick voice line makes sense, so that's actually fitting, but really it's nothing that anyone asked for in the context of this skin. The most popular skins outside of those that often get mentioned in the community are these two. And guess what? Neither of them shows much skin at all. For that we have her default skins and the Halloween skins. I think we're all set here. I guess it goes in line with any cosplay design of adding cleavage where it wasn't before, but that shouldn't be the norm for an in-game skin. The bittersweet irony here is there was another skin concept that actually got quite far in the voting, and I think it ended up in the second place, that looked like this and would have been very easy to translate into an in-game model if some feathers were taken away, because most of this is just armor and just metal that doesn't have to move much and doesn't need its own motion renderings or anything like that. But oh well, such is life. With that, thank you guys for watching. I hope this was interesting, I hope this was informative to some degree. Hope to see you for the next one tomorrow. If you're not subscribed yet, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell, it really helps me out. ZiSotto, out.